So welcome, I am Claire Sadar. I am the program manager here at Historic New England. And for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are the largest and oldest regional heritage organization in the nation. I want to welcome you to this virtual program, one of many we are having this fall, and I will add a link to more programming at the end of the talk and tell you about a few more programs that are coming up next week. So I'm going to hand it over to Ken Torino now to introduce our speakers.
Actually, I'm going to hand it over to Dorothy first.
Okay.
Thank you, Ken and Claire. And I'm Dorothy Clark, Historic New England's Editorial Services Manager and the editor of Historic New England magazine. So welcome to all of you for coming to this very important presentation. It's imperative that we have public discussions on history about race in the United States, as well as in our home communities. And Historic New England recognizes the importance of engaging our audiences and sharing the ways in which the past informs the present, especially in this crucial place at this time. Monuments are curious and sometimes peculiar markers of collective memory. Debates about their presence and representation in public spaces, while not at all new, have recently drawn greater attention, along with the actors who either try to bring about their removal or destruction, or those whose aim it is to ensure that the commemorative landscape remains unchanged. And I recently found a quotation about monuments, and it is by Joseph Joubert, who is a French moralist and essay writer whose lifetime spanned the late 18th century and the early 19th centuries. And he wrote, "Monuments are the links which unite one generation with another. Preserve what your fathers have seen." My question after reading that quotation was, what impressions do our historic landmarks and monuments really leave on the descendants of those who erected them? And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Ken.
Thank you, Dorothy. Both Dorothy and I were very fortunate to hear our speaker, Dr. Ashleigh Lawrence-Sanders, at a webinar that was done in conjunction with the American Association for State and Local History. And it was really extraordinary. And we knew that we had to bring Ashleigh in as a speaker. So I'm here just briefly to give you a little bit of an introduction. And then Dorothy and I are going to monitor the questions. And we really do want this at the end to be a discussion. So please put your questions in the chat, and Dorothy and I will appear back at the end. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers on monuments, memory, and racial justice, Dr. Ashleigh Lawrence-Sanders, an assistant professor of African American history at the University of Dayton. She received her PhD from Rutgers University. At the University of Dayton, she teaches courses on African American history, Black women's history, Civil War memory, and US history. She is currently working on her first book project, They Knew What the War Was About, African Americans and the Memory of the Civil War. And this examines American Civil War memory by centering the construction and meaning of Black memory and counter-memory of the war from 1865 until the near present. And I think we'll be hearing a lot about that tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Lawrence-Sanders. Welcome.
Hi, all. First, thank you so much to Ken and Dorothy and Claire for having me here today in Historic New England and for just welcoming me so nicely. And I have to say that the talk that I gave at the Association for State and Local Histories met a lot of people in my inbox, so that was nice. I'm very happy to talk about this topic, which is, I was discussing with Ken and Dorothy just now, is a topic that is not going away. Funny enough, I think it was maybe 4 years ago, I was sitting in, a panel at Princeton, about the legacy of Woodrow Wilson and about, monuments and changing the names of things. And I kept saying to myself, and I told the audience, it's like, I don't know if we'll still be talking about this in 5 years. I have to say that I'm happy that I was wrong, and that we are still having this very, very important discussion about what is the relationship between racial justice, monuments, and memory. So monuments are coming down very, very quickly right now. I think it's an attestament to the power of protest. Confederate monuments are being removed, other monuments are being removed, and it's all, to me, a part of a much, much longer history of African-American memory. And in the case of the monuments around the Civil War and the Confederacy, Black counter memory of the Civil War. So since the end of the American Civil War, Black Americans have been contesting the domination of, white Southern memory of the war, and even in some instances, white Northern memory of the war, which we'll get to talk about a little bit at the end, maybe. I always argue that understanding Black Civil War memory is actually foundational to understanding racial justice movements. So in a lot of ways, this is sort of the natural alignment of things in this moment that we're in right now, that we're having a conversation about memory and Civil War memory, along with racial justice and, racial justice for incidents of racial violence in particular. So of course, what's happening right now, and this should be, of course, familiar to everyone here, is that, since the end of May of this year, May 2020, there has been consistent protests and unrest in almost every major city in the United States. And it's mostly as a result, the direct result of the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So the protests began in Minneapolis, and then they spread out to nearly every state, every major city, small and mid-sized cities, and yes, even suburbs, in which many of you may come from suburbs who've had smaller protests as well. It's actually the longest standing, longest lasting mass demonstration, like, constant, consistent days of just demonstration in this country since the 1960s. So, I tell this to people all the time. I tell it to my students, if it feels like you're living in a moment where a lot is happening, it's true, a lot is happening in this moment. As you can tell from this image, this is probably one of the most well-known images to come out of this moment of, monument vandalism and contextualization, or I call it extra legal contextualization. This is this image from Richmond, Virginia, and this is the Lee Monument, where, they took over with all the graffiti, but then they projected onto the monument this image of George Floyd. And of course, Black Lives Matter is emboldened at the top and across this powerful question statue at the top. So what role have monuments played in this struggle? So these are still two images, right? On the one on the left is an image of a monument that was taken down by protesters themselves in North Carolina. The image on the right is a monument of John C. Calhoun, which was removed after the Charleston City Council voted to finally remove the Calhoun Monument, which is a high monument that sits at the very center of the main part of downtown Charleston. So how do we get to this point? Well, part of these protests target Confederate monuments, and some were targeted for vandalism and destruction. Some have legal removals, some not have legal removals. Why are monuments a part of what people have targeted while they've been out in the streets and angry and chanting and protesting against racial violence? Well, I'm going to go back in history, as we historians love to do. We like to start at the beginning, or what we like to say is the beginning. And that beginning is really understanding the history of the lost cause, in particular the history of the lost cause and the impact that it's had on the commemorative landscape of not just the South, but the North, the Midwest, and the West as well. So these are just some of the main tenets of the lost cause philosophy. The one of the things to note about the lost cause is that it emerges, in its height in the late 19th century into the early 20th century, though the elements of the lost cause are present by the end of the war. So when we think about the height of the lost cause, we think about, these legacy organizations like the United Daughters of Confederacy, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a few minutes, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, the Southern Historical Society, and all the, the histories and the articles that they're producing, creating this mythology. And these are sort of the central tenets of this mythology, which is that, it's not the Civil War, it's the War of Northern Aggression. Slavery was not the cause of the war. And also, slavery was actually benign. It wasn't a violent institution. The South was noble and chivalrous. And of course, a really huge tenet of the lost cause is the consistent glorification and sometimes deification of leaders and soldiers of the Confederacy as a part of a defense of a white Southern way of life. So, Confederate monuments that were erected from the late 19th century on, and most of them were erected from the late 19th century to early 20th century, are part of the lost cause movement. And it's this mythology that white Southerners create to sort of make sense of their loss during the war, but also to reify white supremacy throughout the South. So this is the important thing to note, is that this movement is not just about nostalgia. It's not even just about commemorating military battles in the war. It is a movement with power, right? And the myths that were nurtured by this movement were then turned around and used to subjugate Black Americans throughout the South. So, this is a chart that I took a few years ago from Southern Poverty Law Center, which I think actually encapsulates a lot about how monuments were built, Confederate monuments at the very least. So you can tell from this graph that most of the monuments were built in the late 19th to early 20th century. And one of the helpful things I think about this, this sort of plot map here of, graph, is that you see that, they differentiate between monuments on courthouse grounds, which is a huge, huge, huge percentage of monuments throughout the South. Confederate monuments are on courthouse grounds. And then later on, we see by the 50s and 60s, more blue dots, which of course are schools, which naturally coincides with school desegregation battles of the 1950s and the 1960s. So you see more schools being named after Confederate icons and heroes during this time period, and a way to sort of encapsulate on the landscape the type of history they want as this last grasp of control over the public school system throughout the South. So this is the time period, this late 19th, early 20th century, that most historians would consider the height of the lost cause. I argue, though, that because we see remnants of, the lost cause sort of everywhere beyond the building of this monument, this may have been the height, but we do not see the end of the lost cause completely, even down into the present. Some historians would say that the lost cause pretty much ended, 19 teens, 1920s. In recent years, there have been a lot of good work in the 20s and 30s, and Nina Silber has a really great book called "This War Ain't Over" about New Deal era United States and how there's still these battles over the memory of the Civil War. My own work, I go to the near present, and and of course it makes sense because we see this happening right now, but it happens consistently throughout time. And as you can see, there are still Confederate monuments being built into the 2000 teens. I think I saw one that was built in South Carolina just a few years ago. So, it never really quite ended either. So, as I mentioned before, one of the most important organizations of the lost cause and the keeper of the lost cause was the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And, one of the interesting things about the United Daughters of the Confederacy is that they're pretty much responsible for a huge chunk of the Confederate monuments and markers that we see, not just throughout the South, but throughout the entire nation. So, when there was a controversy in New York some years ago about a Confederate marker, it was, discovered that it was placed there by the UDC because the UDC was a national organization. White Southern women were moving all over the United States, and they were making sure that they were making their mark all across the United States as well. They were formed in 1894. And, of course, to be a member, you had to have, Confederate heritage, literally a daughter of the Confederacy. And, much of the focus of the UDC was, monuments, building monuments, financing monuments. But as many historians like Karen Cox, who wrote a really, really excellent book about the UDC called Dixie's Daughters, would say, is that actually their true impact was in the teaching and writing of histories. And that had a massive impact on the way that people talk about the Civil War, even nationally. So the ways that we talk about the war not being about slavery. And if you go and look at some polls, even 10, 15 years ago, I think they're a bit better now, you would see sometimes 50%, 40 to 50% of the United States population saying that the Civil War wasn't about slavery. I have someone tell me that at least twice a year when I give a talk. I have students say that. So, and these aren't people in the South, by the way. These are people outside the South. So that should tell you that there was some success in this reach of really moving the educational and historical writing in the direction of the lost cause. So the monuments were sort of the tangible concrete and stone formations of the lost cause, and they still endure, but the real legacy may actually be in the way that the history was taught around the Civil War. That's taken a lot of years of undoing for many of our excellent history teachers. So this is just one example. So this is Mildred Lewis Rutherford. She was sort of the chief historian of the UDC for many years. This was published in 1920. This is her truths, right? A fair, unbiased, impartial, unprejudiced, and conscientious study of history. Just so you know what you're about to get, right? These are the truths of history. And so I always use this to kind of illustrate, these are just like, you could do a check mark here. These are the check marks of the tenets of the lost cause. One being here that secession was not rebellion. Seceding was not rebelling against the country, of course not. The war between the states was not fought to hold the slaves. Interesting. And of course, this one, the slaves were not ill-treated in the South, and the North was largely responsible for their presence in the South. These are the different sections. There are more to this, but these are some of the different sections in Mildred Lewis Rutherford's, truths of histories, right? So the histories like this example are the same histories or mythologies that underline the monuments that we're seeing being vandalized and or removed rapidly over the last 5-6 months and over the last 4 or 5 years. So how do African Americans respond to these monuments? Black people responded in various ways to the erections of these monuments. And, as I hinted earlier, in my sort of introduction, it's kind of a starting point to understanding the protests today. It is what places the current anti-monument protesters in a much larger trajectory of both history and memory. There were public fights against Confederate monuments like, this one here from John Mitchell Jr., who was editor of the Richmond Planet, which was a Black newspaper in the late 19th and early 20th century in Richmond, Virginia. And this here is, part of his front page where he's talking about the Lee Monument being unveiled. And the Lee Monument is the first monument on Monument Avenue in Richmond. And that's the monument that you saw in that first image, which has been vandalized and had that projection of the image of George Floyd. So he says here, we venture the assertion that nowhere in the South has a grander parade taken place. All of this was done in honor of the Confederate chieftain, General Robert E. Lee, and the cause for which he fought. Rebel flags were everywhere displayed in the long lines of Confederate veterans who embraced the opportunity and attended the reunion to join again in the rebel yell. So he describes very specifically what's happening. And later on in this editorial, he actually talks a bit about how disturbing it is to him that he saw no American flags displayed, and that the South was going way too far in displaying and erecting these monuments, and that it would be damaging to the country long term and damaging to the long-term progress of reconciliation and reunion for the South to erect these types of monuments. So there may have been, more direct forms of confrontation against this monument, but Mitchell stands out because he's a prominent newspaper editor. He doesn't hold his tongue. He also later becomes an alderman in there. So, he carries on this fight against the Lee Monument and against the, the lost cause, and he names it and calls it the lost cause specifically several times in many of his writings. So, there's editorial fights. There's also vandalism. So vandalizing monuments is not a new thing. Defacing monuments is not a new thing. Vandalism was common and frequent. And while we don't know the race of many of these, perpetrators, in some of these cases, just by, in the ones that I've studied and looking at, where it happened, how it happened, it may be more than likely they were African American or Black citizens of these different cities. So these articles are clips from, these are separate clips from articles about monument vandalizations throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. You can see this one is in Chatham, and it says in North Carolina, it says, hanging too good for miscreant who defaced Confederate monument. On last Monday night was perpetrated one of the most disgraceful acts of vandalism ever known in this community. This here is about the damage of a monument in Monroe, and it says, the veterans of Henry Allen Camp are all good citizens are rather over a piece of vandalism that is so contemptible it makes their blood boil. People were really dramatic writing in newspapers during this time period, by the way. It says, a monument recently erected to the memory of the patriotic soldiers of the lost cause by cracking and breaking one of the marble cannon. And this is the thing, some of these monuments were vandalized right after they went up, which is interesting. And this is, of course, this is one about Alexandria, about, a monument in Alexandria being vandalized or defaced. And so there, I've collected myself, or I write about, about 10 to 15 of these instances over time. And it just provides a connection that, extra legal contextualization or vandalism or defacing is not a new thing. It's not unique to these protests that we're seeing currently, in this summer into this fall. It's actually part of a much larger history as well. And so also, when, groups like the UDC wanted to erect new monuments and national monuments, like the Mammy Memorial that, was proposed for the National Mall in DC, then a sort of letter writing and editorial campaign, mostly led by Black women activists, took over. So in the early 1920s, the United Daughters of the Confederacy had made a push to have a Mammy Memorial erected on the National Mall. Mammy, of course, is this mythical, loyal Black woman who's a household slave. She's a central figure for the UDC, and a central figure of Confederate iconography, of course, because in order to teach that slavery is benign, right, and not harmful to Black Americans, you need a stereotypical faithful slave, right, an image of a faithful slave, a person who was loyal and devoted to their white owners, because that then can, underlie this entire sort of myth of like the paternalistic, benign slavery that, is part of, one of the central tenets of the lost cause. So Black women's organizations saw this and they were like, no. Mary Church Terrell and, Hallie Brown were, they were infuriated. They were part of the National Association of Colored Women, a Black women's club. And so they started to write letters, saying how much of a disgrace it would be to have this monument up. And it's also notable that this monument happened, this monument was being pushed at the same time that, there was a push in the African-American community to get the dire anti-lynching bill pushed, right? So you can see here from this editorial cartoon, which was in the Baltimore Afro-American, of course, a Black newspaper based out of Baltimore and DC, you see these two images here. It said, "And grateful memory to one we never paid a cent of wages during a lifetime of service," right? And then this over here says, "Use that monument fund to pass a law that will stop lynching of my children." So they've used this image of Mammy and then they've subverted it, right, to talk about the actual conditions of Black Americans and Black women in particular. And that's, essentially what Mary Church Terrell and others did. They said, why are we honoring this mythical Black woman and not talking about the horrors of slavery that Black women endured or the terrible conditions that Black women live today? Eventually, it got so much negative attention that it never happened, of course, because we never have seen a Mammy Memorial in the National Mall. So Black activism was successful in eliminating that potential, right? So monument vandalism actually, occurs during the 20s and 30s and 40s, a bit less, or at least you see it in newspapers a bit less, and you start to pick it up a bit more. You see it more in reports when you get to the 1960s and 1970s. And of course, the 1960s and 1970s is when we're getting into the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power Movement. And so this is one of these instances. And, the interesting thing about the 60s and the 70s is that, over and over, time and time again, what you see throughout the history of African Americans since the end of the Civil War is that in periods of high social unrest and social movements, confrontations and clashes over memory and commemoration increase. So once again, the moment that we're in is sort of a natural trajectory. This summer, I think, is probably the most confrontation we've seen directly, all in a short amount of time, probably since the Civil Rights Movement and since the Black Power Movement. And I actually, I argue in my own work that the 60s and 70s Black protest movements were trying to really reclaim an emancipationist view, as David Blight would argue, an emancipationist view of the war, emancipationist narrative of the war. So, while in the 60s and 70s, in the 60s, we have the Civil War centennial, the centennial is not really seen as success. And a lot of reasons why is because they don't really cling on to the idea that, the protests that are happening can be a part of this, long history of Black people struggling for emancipation, because that narrative is damaging to a progressive narrative of change that the US government is trying to put forward in the 1960s, of course, partially because of the Cold War. So you have a US government, even the Democratic presidents, who are trying to actually silence any challenge to this narrative that we've come so far since 1860s and we're fighting a civil war from slavery and emancipation. At the same time, where you're having Black activists say, we have not been fully emancipated. So there's a disconnect between the way that, even white Northerners are trying to position the war as this great sort of narrative of progress over 100 years and the way that Black Americans are trying to position the war. So this is like an image, was taken, in 1966. Black activists, young Black activists and SNCC and other groups talked about Confederate flags and monuments a lot. I've read a lot of their oral histories where they talk specifically about these monuments and, how these monuments were sort of positioned as, centers of violence. And, in 1966, a young SNCC activist, Sammy Young, is killed after a confrontation. I think it was at a gas station bathroom in Alabama when, the white man who's accused of murdering him is acquitted. There was a student demonstration with students from nearby Tuskegee and other colleges. And as part of the demonstration, they defaced a Confederate monument in downtown Tuskegee. And, there's several phrases on here, and one of them is Black Power. So since the 1960s, most of these confrontations over Civil War memory have involved actually the Confederate flag. There were a lot of Confederate flag battles. The Confederate flag goes atop of the State House in South Carolina in the early 1960s. And, the official reason was because they were celebrating the Civil War centennial, but then it never comes down. We see battles at, colleges in the South, in the North, in the West from the 50s, 60s, and 70s on about the display of the Confederate flag. The monuments are still being, argued about. There's still tensions over monuments and monument space in the South and even, places in the North and West as well. And that kind of does lead us a little bit into what I like to say the first phase of the current rapid monument renewal, because the Confederate flag battles of, the 80s and 90s lead us to, the year 2000 in South Carolina, where the Confederate flag is taken from atop of the South Carolina State House and then moved to a pretty still prominent spot on the State House grounds as part of a law called the Heritage Act. And this Heritage Act, just going to keep this in mind because it's an important law. This Heritage Act, allowed for the removal of the flag from the State House. And also as part of sort of this deal between, Black lawmakers and more liberal lawmakers, was that they would finally make Martin Luther King Jr. Day a holiday, but also Confederate Memorial Day became a state holiday. All of this happened in the Heritage Act. And, one of the most important things that happened also was that it continued protection of Confederate monuments in South Carolina. So we'll get to like what that means a little bit, in a short while when I get to the end of the talk. But the first wave of recent monument removals really happens in earnest in 2015. And it happens because of the tragic killing of 9 Black parishioners in the Mayo AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And they were killed by a white supremacist who prominently, among many of the offensive images that he displayed himself with, which are known white nationalist and white supremacist image, was the Confederate flag. So it got people to thinking, why is our state, why are these people still associated with the Confederate flag? Why is the Confederate flag sitting on, public grounds? Of course, you guys probably remember that image of the activist Bree Newsom climbing up the flagpole and snatching the flag down. And in a very, very quick way, and almost 2 months after the Mayo AME massacre happens, the state government votes to remove the flag entirely, with the backing of Nikki Haley, who was governor at the time. So this happens after Emanuel, but I also like to point out that while this did happen in a post-Emanuel AME context, it also happened in a world that was sort of after the advent of Black Lives Matter, where Black Lives Matter has become a potent movement, and a movement that's younger, sometimes more interracial. And so these long-standing anti-monument sentiments in local communities start to pick up after the Confederate flag. We start to question the Calhoun monuments in South Carolina, and the other Confederate monuments, the monuments in New Orleans and Baltimore, and in Georgia and all these southern states. The things that are still named after Confederates outside the South start to get questioned. And so Black Lives Matter movement in Charleston in particular had gotten to be a pretty large movement because of 2 months before the Mayo AME massacre, Walter Scott was killed by a police officer shot in his back in North Charleston. This was sort of one of these sort of well-known cases at the time. So part of this was specifically, what happens after Mayo AME. A lot of it was a youth-led movement that had a broad goal against racial violence, but started to broaden their goals beyond, police violence to include the commemorative landscape. So we can't understand the current waves that have continued around racial violence without understanding, around the Confederate monuments without understanding the Black Lives Matter movement and the role that it plays, and shoring up protests very quickly and joining together with a lot of long-standing intergenerational anti-monument protests and lingering feelings in many communities. So historically, Black activists have targeted the vestiges of the lost cause alongside much larger structural goals, as just, I went through. So this was normal. So we get, the removals, right? We see, Mitch Landrieu in New Orleans, he gives this really great speech about understanding the Confederacy and what it means and the type of place we want, New Orleans and Louisiana to be. So then we see, the Lee Monument and others in New Orleans come down. Baltimore City Council quickly removes Confederate monuments. This is the Confederate Women's Monument coming down there. But then we start to see a backlash, right? So, there are two things happening, by 2017. One is that the anti-monument protests, like I said, had coalesced around Black Lives Matter protests and vice versa. they joined together, different sort of communities, constituencies to try to dismantle monuments. And two, and this is what happens in Charlottesville, is that we're seeing sort of, pro-monument or counter-protesters coalescing completely around the alt-right and vice versa, alt-right coalescing around, and pro-monument sentiment. White supremacist and nationalist organizations that are part of this sort of reinvigorated alt-right, they start to use monuments as sort of their rallying cry and the rallying point. So this is an image from, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, of course, where unfortunately a young activist, Heather Heyer, is killed, is run down by a white supremacist. And so, the imagery and meaning, for the alt-right of these monuments is obviously beyond just nostalgia. This is a rallying cry for them. You will not replace us. It's about, these ideas of, white civilization, and all this is uniting around monuments. So in a lot of ways, their presence in Charlottesville is actually confirming the monument's original meanings, right? So we're getting sort of this confirmation of like, what do Confederate monuments mean? Were they there to sort of reify, the ideas of white supremacy within, not just the South? If that's the case, then, we've seen it explicitly, right? In the ways that we've seen the alt-right and these types of groups be there to, support in favor of keeping these monuments. They're not the only groups doing this, of course, but I think that it's notable that we're seeing a stronger divide on who wants to keep Confederate monuments in particular versus who thinks that they should go. All right, so just to wrap up a little bit here over the next, few minutes, I think, the extra legal contextualization is what's really sort of setting this moment apart, I think, from other previous moments, is that it's happening so rapidly. So, in many ways, this linkage between Civil War memory and racial violence is as old as the Civil War is, old, 150 years plus. The physical space that these monuments take up matter, and the physical space they represent matter. Monuments went up without the input and consent of the local communities, have taken millions and millions of dollars to maintain. Some of them have become markers of racial violence, like literally sites where racial violence have happened. Others are sort of more abstract markers of segregation and gentrification. So the protesters look for a place to enact their physical rage against a landscape that was sometimes openly hostile to them, or at the very least not representative of certain communities. Monuments are sort of easy targets. They can easily be hit or defaced. They can easily be, just knocked over in a matter of not just, making a very specific political statement about that particular figure, but also just sometimes rage. And I think that's kind of been lost in some of the conversation around some of the monuments that have been defaced and knocked over, right? Another question that I see sort of floating around is sort of why haven't people waited for local governments to remove monuments? And I also point out, which is that the legal processes for taking down monuments have stalled in so many cities. City leaderships and mayors delayed controversial decisions for years and years and years. In Charleston, there was an attempt to put up a plaque to contextualize the Calhoun monument. And the plaque, had this, the original language is something about how Calhoun supported an institution that perpetrated crimes against humanity. And some people thought that was too anachronistic and also too harsh. So they wanted to water down the language. And then, some African-American politicians in the area were like, we just want the monument down, period. So then nothing happened because, it was something the local leadership didn't want to touch. So the protesters pushed the issue, and then they actually forced these local municipalities to make these decisions. So the final decisions being left up to the people may not have been the ideal solution that a lot of people search for, but having these tough conversations about what our landscape looks like may mean making a tough decision. And if our political leaders are not going to do it, yes, in a moment of protest and anger, the decision may be made without the democratic processes that I think a lot of people cherish. So are we moving beyond Confederate monuments? We are. And it's I would say the most controversial aspect of all of this is this move beyond. So it's notable, of course, that this is spread beyond the Confederate monuments. In Philadelphia, we saw the Frank Rizzo statue first vandalized and then removed. You know, Frank Rizzo was this, you know, a racist police chief and mayor of Philadelphia. You know, his statue, there was sort of this promise about the discussion of his statue over years, and then protesters vandalized it, tried to pull it down, and finally the city agreed to remove it. You know, in New Mexico, we saw, you know, the statue of the Spanish conquistador, Juan de Oñate, come down after violent confrontation. We also saw the agreement that a Teddy Roosevelt statue outside the Natural History Museum in New York would come down. You know, there have been various Columbus statues have come down. And yes, in, you know, y'all's neck of the woods, there have been discussions around these statues, the Robert Gould Shaw and the 54th Memorial, as well as the Emancipation Group statues. What they represent, also the fact that people deface this monument and what it means to deface a monument that's about Union soldiers and Black soldiers, right? And, you know, what it means to have a copy of this emancipation statue, which of course, you know, there's been a lot of discussion around the original statue in DC around this image of a kneeling slave, you know, which is about emancipation. This is supposedly about uplift, but is this really just about Lincoln? Because even on the statue, it says what, you know, a race set free and the country at peace, Lincoln rests from his labors. There's nothing here necessarily that, you know, other than the word emancipation that you would think would, you know, mean anything about African Americans, right? So we're seeing these controversies sort of pop up over, you know, statues that, you know, are a little bit more complex and may not be the statues that we think should come down or be contextualized. And I think that that's natural because there really has not been a major city that has not been touched by these issues in some ways. So if we agree that the issues of racial justice are national, right, then it would make sense that we would also agree that the issues of racial justice and how they're manifested within the commemorative landscape would also be natural. And I think it is necessary to kind of start to move beyond Confederate monuments, which I think and sometimes can fall into the easy traitor statues, right? That a lot of people would agree, oh, well, we don't want the statues of the traitors up, right? And then, you know, that's that. But, you know, an acknowledgement of the basic fact that this country's relationship to white supremacy goes beyond the South and beyond the Confederacy, you know, and it being, you know, widespread and foundational to many places would mean that we have to talk about the sites in many of these places. So what comes next? I don't know. I don't know, but I'll end here with this image and sort of with a probing question, which is that, you know, what do we want our state and local landscapes to look like? No matter what the origin of the monuments are, the confrontations over them are indicative of the ways that some people feel disconnected from the local landscapes that they live on, that they pay taxes to, that they are born in often. I'm wary of the way that, you know, in this particular time period of social unrest and pandemic, you know, historians love a deliberative process that we're going to have a trial and jury over monuments and, you know, a voting pattern. But I do think a much longer phase of rethinking how we envision the purpose of local history beyond monuments and beyond the physical landscape, which has been so much time and money and effort devoted to, is justified, right? So for me as a historian, preservation of history means preservation, yes, of physical space, but even more than that. So if anything, you know, the protests over racial injustice expose these longstanding tensions around us, not just the explicit violence that's been replayed over and over, but also the ways that statues and monuments and historical markers are representative of particular politics and ideologies and not necessarily representative of others. So I think, you know, if this is a time of questioning, you know, who the United States is as a nation, you know, what is Massachusetts as a state? What do we want from the world that's around us and the abstract? Then yes, we also have to look at the tangible and the physical as well. So I will end there, and I look very much forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. That was really amazing. And thank you for putting the lost cause in perspective, the beginning of these monuments, what they really mean. We've got some great questions in our chat and our Q&A. And I think Dorothy's going to start you off, and I'll go next. Dorothy?
Okay. Well, there was one comment that I wanted to make, and that's about the embrace of these statues and monuments. Because for the most part, I think a statue just sits there and it's barely noticed until someone says something about it. Like the monument in Boston, very few people knew about the Lincoln Emancipation Group monument. It was something I had stumbled over many years ago and went, okay, it's there. And by the same token, though, you've got, there's this memorial to Emmett Till, and it's a sign, and someone keeps shooting it and destroying it, and they replace it. Why? Especially since there really is no, Emmett Till was not a controversial figure, he was an innocent figure, but I just find it very interesting when people start to embrace and notice their statues. So I'm going to get to a first question for you, and I'm sure some of the stuff that I just said kind of weaves into these questions. So we've got, someone mentions the Shaw Memorial, and if we could talk about its place in this type of dialogue.
It's interesting. I think that maybe 10 or 15 years ago, we would see the Shaw Memorial as being completely uncontroversial, right? But I think, and I also put the movie Glory in that conversation as well, a movie that, I'd watched when I was a teenager, really enjoyed, because, I'm from South Carolina originally. I grew up hearing about the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, like all of these things as part of like Black South Carolina history. And I actually rewatched Glory last year when I taught, and I rewatched it the other night at Historians at the Movies on Twitter, which is so fun to just see the historians chatting about films. And I was just really thinking through, Shaw, and because at the closing shot of that film is actually the Shaw Memorial. And, I thought about why I've heard, so much around Shaw and what my own thoughts about this movie is. And they're complicated now that I'm older and also a historian, to be frank. Like, they're a bit more complicated. And I don't think it's necessarily about Shaw, as a figure, or it's how Shaw's been placed in this narrative around Black Civil War history. And, one of the things a teacher actually wrote me about this, because her students were discussing this, she's in the Boston area, and she said that her students actually thought that there was not a fair representation of Black soldiers, in that memorial, that, we don't see the same sort of equal representation, even still, Shaw's on the horse above, all these soldiers in that image. And that, they're just kind of these nameless, faceless figures, and it's, Shaw's at the center of it, right? And like, even the fact that we call it the Shaw Memorial, which, it's, the full name is, right, isn't it the Shaw and 54th Regiment Memorial, or not? Yes, okay.
Yes.
So, but we call it the Shaw Memorial, and that's just not like a critique, but I call it the Shaw Memorial too, and I wanted to be more explicit, because when I was writing about it a few months ago, I was like, well, this is actually not the whole name. I think it's complicated. I think, in a lot of ways it reflects, at least from my understanding of local history and in New England and the Boston area, it reflects the tendency of like highlighting white abolitionism, right? Which is like sort of this pride, it's a prideful thing. And it should be like, there's so many prominent abolitionists came from there. Shaw's family were abolitionists, of course. But also not highlighting the people themselves who were really integral in freeing themselves. And these soldiers were integral in freeing themselves. And some of them, many of them were from Massachusetts. So what would that memorial look like if we were centering the Black soldiers in that unit, particularly the ones that were from Massachusetts? Does the Shaw Memorial need to go? maybe not necessarily, but maybe there needs to be something that also gives as much weight to these soldiers as it does to Shaw. Because I think it's convenient also because, you know, Shaw's not, you know, he's not a Robert E. Lee, right? Like, that's what I said, we can easily shove the Robert E. Lees aside. If Shaw was not a bad person, Shaw was a good person, all these things. But like the way that we position Shaw is performing a type of erasure of the story of Black people serving. And the 54th is very important in Black Civil War memory. It comes up constantly in my research to the 1940s, 1950s. You know, every time, you know, the US was calling on Black people to fight in a war, you see people be like, well, remember the 54th? You know, we fought in the wars and Civil War. And then, you know, what happened after that? Like, they were an important part of this memory. And I would just like to see an equal amount of weight, you know, given. And doesn't even have to be to an individual Black soldier. It could be to like the group of the Black soldiers. Maybe that means leaving the Shaw Memorial as the Shaw Memorial and making a 54th on its own. Because I don't, you know, and that's just, you know, that's not my official recommendation, but I'm just thinking through the ways. And I think that, you know, the film Glory too kind of reifies that. I have issues. The movie's still very emotional for me in a lot of ways because it's so well done. But I also think that there are ways that, you know, the story is still so centered around Shaw that, you know, wouldn't probably get made in the same way today. At least I would hope not. Yeah.
So Ashleigh, we have several questions from Lynn, Russell, and Jack about position. What's your thoughts about in relocating these monuments to recontextualize the history they represent, as opposed to taking them down and erasing this part of history? And there were a couple of references to what's been done, you know, in Budapest with moving statuary from the Soviet occupation to parks. I've seen some done. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I really think it depends because I think it'd be very hard depending because we have so many monuments. Like, I think there's hundreds, plural. I don't want to give an exact number of even Confederate monuments. And only a small percentage have come down. So there's still hundreds left. So then practically you have to think through, you know, how many of these need to be saved? That's number one. Number two, some of them are just so big that like the space that they take up couldn't really be in a museum. It could only be an outdoor park. And then the question again becomes, and this is what I like to bring up, is it worth it? And is there an agreement where people would agree to, you know, start contributing more tax money to, you know, the upkeep of monuments in a different location, right? And I think you're bumping up against that a little bit. And I think that's what makes it complicated. I've seen statues that have been removed, smaller ones to museums, you know, even like smaller markers and stuff to museums. I think markers make more sense than statues just practically. Like I've seen historical markers in museums. I think they're powerful because they're in a place where they can be contextualized. Maybe now with the Mellon Foundation money, you know, like I said, the cost is an issue. Maybe with the Mellon Foundation money of reimagining this, that's a lot of money. You know.
Do you want to tell the audience what that is? They may not have seen that.
Oh, so there was a big announcement a couple of days ago now that, you know, the Mellon Foundation, and I think Elizabeth Alexander is the president of that, you know, she's a poet, right? And this huge announcement that they're going to dedicate $250 million to reimagining monuments. That's a very vague thing, right? That could mean a lot. And reimagining the spaces of these monuments or reimagining how we build monuments or think about monuments. I saw all that in the article. So that could mean a lot to a lot of local cities and states, local historical societies and organizations that are really trying to work through these issues. And if money is the issue, and if you do not want to spend more public money on this, then that could be an alternative. If you think this is a monument worth preserving in some sort of way. Some people have said, put the monuments in park, let them get grown over, let the vandalism stay as part of like, you know, the recontextualization of it. I think there's been a lot of creative things. That last image of the base of the monument, I would just love for that to be kept somewhere with just the graffiti on it, right? Like, I think that's such that imagery is so powerful. And, you know, if you want to talk about what happened in the summer of 2020, you can look at that and know what the summer of 2020 was like. But I think, just looking at the physical makeup and the architectural, how do I say this? Some of these monuments are ugly and cheaply made, and no one's really going to want to preserve them, right? Like some of them are just, not the greatest looking things, like even from an aesthetic view. So I don't know if there'll be a decision like, that's too ugly to preserve or not. But, I think that you might just run into the problem that some local communities don't want them to be preserved. Some of them do want destruction. So that's where these hard conversations come in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's try this. How do we give context to the creation of these monuments, such as the Lincoln and the kneeling man, which some people have described as looking like he's shining Lincoln shoes? And the questioner says, meaning early fundraising efforts that lead to the commission and the changed roles that lead to the result we see today.
That's hard because as much as I like the idea of contextualization as a historian who reads everything, I don't know how much people read. And I will say this, that, I talked about the Calhoun statue in the plaque and how that was such a huge argument. Also in Baltimore, those statues had contextualization attached to them. The Confederate ones did, the ones they ended up removing. So I don't know if contextualization then becomes a step, like the middle step towards removal, because contextualization in the end wasn't enough. And, I do think that often, depending on the statue, the physicality of it may not survive contextualization. And I'm not sure what the physical location of that statue now, how many people are going to come and like read the context of this Black man kneeling at Lincoln's foot. How do we get this? Does it mean a rededication with a new, where you're getting around media and attention to what this means? Like I know in DC, there's been this constant try to re-educate people about the origins of it, like, saying, free Black people paid for this, but then it's like the further history of that is that their ideas were also ignored, right? And that, several African Americans hated this statue, and then it's been a point of contention throughout DC, over the years. So, I mean, I don't know how you do that with just like the contextualized plaque, though that may be a placeholder for a more difficult conversation down the line. And that's, Baltimore's contextualization happened not that much before they actually just removed it. So I have to say that we've seen contextualizations happen and sort of be improved, and then the monuments be removed anyway. So that just may be the natural trajectory of it all. I don't know.
I did like, we were talking earlier, Ashleigh, about the historians descending upon Gettysburg and reinterpreting. I mean, that's not practical to happen with every Civil War monument.
Yeah.
But it was, I mean, it engaged people in discussion, debate.
Yes.
That's something that I find really useful, and like tonight's program. I mean, having discussion about this, because I'm at heart a preservationist. I hate seeing things destroyed. I know from the panel that you were on before that a lot of these monuments could be ordered just out of the catalog. As you said, they really don't have any artistic merit, but, I'm kind of torn personally. I've seen, some in museums at the University of Texas at Austin, where they brought these sculptures in and they interpreted them, and I thought it was really well done. But your point is well taken. You can't do it with everything.
Yeah, and I think that's, that's just a difficult conversation around it. And I never really quite know what to say, because I think often, we are sort of tied to these sort of the physical presence of these things. And, I think what the historians did was excellent. I think this kind of goes to my broader point, is that these conversations could be a lot easier when we get people more engaged and connected to their local histories. So when, the Shaw Memorial was vandalized, I saw a lot of tisk-tissing, and I was like, how many people know the history of the Shaw Memorial and the 54th Massachusetts Regiment? Like, how many of them know that history? How many of them, you know, are they stopping to read? Do they know the history of Black soldiers? Do they know what that means? And, you know, not to say even if they knew it, they wouldn't have still done it. Like I said, a lot of these things are done out of anger without any sort of like particular political statement in that moment. But like the disconnect people feel causes them to do that, even if they may not know what it is. They just know that it's a statue, and that's the disconnect that people are feeling to their local histories. So like the thing that the historians did is great, because you're bringing people in to a site and asking them to talk about what it is in a really direct way that's backed up with the history and the context, but also something we just don't do. You know, historians don't do it. We don't really go out into our communities like that, which is a critique of my own profession, to be honest. Mm-hmm. You know, we really don't go out into our own communities and try to get as involved in, you know, state and local histories in the world around us in the way that we should. And I think that, you know, we should do more of that, definitely.
Well, great.
Yes.
Dorothy, there's one question that you could probably answer, and that's about the Confederate monument at Oak Bluffs.
Oh boy.
There's a question. Dorothy has association with Oak Bluffs. So.
That is the statue that got me started paying attention to monuments. And you look at it from afar, it looks like a standard Union soldier, everyman soldier statue. You walk up close to it, it's got the most interesting, well, it had the most interesting plaques on it. It was erected by a Confederate veteran who moved to the vineyard. His neighbors didn't like him, and he kept trying and trying and trying to fit in. So finally he had this monument erected to the Union soldiers. Nice. Few years later, well, you know, when those statues really started to be erected all over the place with the Lost Cause, there was a plaque added where it honored also Confederate soldiers. So it was probably the only statue in the nation that honored both Confederate and Union soldiers. It had been the source of controversy for years, and the plaques were finally removed last year, a couple of years ago. But what I find I'm conflicted about is the fact that with the explanatory plaques gone, the statue has no context. It really has no story. So if I were to walk up to the statue today, I'd go, it's exactly what I thought it was all those years that I didn't get close to it. Just your general everyman statue. So the story of it has been removed, but those plaques have been placed in a museum on Martha's Vineyard. But I don't know, I'm conflicted.
Yeah, though there is a history of these sort of dual statues in the North. I know there's one in Michigan where there's like a Confederate soldier and a Union soldier, or that they're honoring both groups of soldiers. I call them reunion statues or reconciliation statues, which, like, you know, once there was sectional reconciliation reunion, this idea, you know, the brothers against brothers, and we're a reunited family as a nation that emerges post 1913, 1915 in particular. You see a lot of these kinds of statues there. And they're difficult because they seem like, I think, deceptively non-controversial, because they're like, oh, well, you know, of course we're honoring both sides. Yes. There are very few war memorials that honor both sides. So that says a lot about the way that we think about the Civil War.
Yes,
like
the chasm is closed. That's what one of the plaques on this monument said.
And that's that, you know, cross the great chasm, like, you know, the reaching across regions.
Reconciliation.
Narrative that becomes popular nationally by the early 20th century.
Right.
And that's a huge part of how we understand the war. So the war, you know, is this, you know, internal fraternal conflict, right? Between, you know, white brothers in the North and South, and then inadvertently Black people are erased from that narrative because of the, you know, who's joining together. as
because
mothers after that.
exactly, the reconciliation did not include Black people.
Yeah.
And the reconciliation came about after Reconstruction was demolished.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Gosh.
Well, I'm conscious of our time,
Yes.
and thank you, Ashleigh, again.
Yes,
I want
thank
to
you.
thank everyone who participated in the discussion. I'm sorry if we didn't get to all the questions.
Yeah,
And then
sorry
just
to
in,
answer your questions, but.
but you did a great job. I'm going to turn this over to Claire, who is going to tell us what's coming up next.
Thanks, Ken, and thank you, Dr. Lawrence-Sanders. That was amazing and really fascinating and thought-provoking talk. I'm sure all of us will be thinking about that next time we are hearing or seeing a statue, one of these controversial statues.